Okay, we'll pick up again, please.
Running at the council, can we agree, has been proactive in promoting regeneration in Urmston and Woodend?
Yes, in fact it has.
Thank you. It, as we see in the evidence, purchased the shopping centre in Urmston in 1999.
Yes.
And promoted its regeneration and redevelopment.
Yes.
And indeed, that was supported by the UDP, which identified the town centre as a regeneration area.
Indeed.
It also identified, the UDP identified Woodsend Circle as an area for regeneration.
I believe so, yes.
Now, the work that has taken place on site, and obviously the inspector, I suspect he may well already had a look anyway, but will be able to have a look. That has not been without its difficulties, has it?
No.
Sure. There were clearly problems with the residential phase 1 of the town centre redevelopment.
I understand there were problems with it. They had to change the scheme relating to that element.
But of course, the big benefit that the scheme did have was the presence of Sainsbury's, wasn't it?
Yes.
And whilst it is fair to observe that there have been issues with redevelopment or development generally over the last few years, one area that has still been proceeding has been supermarket or superstore redevelopment, hasn't it?
Well, retail food stores have been the strongest element within the retail sector. That is absolutely true. But more particularly so in stores which are outside the centres, rather than stores which are part of a town centre redevelopment.
Yeah. Although, again, I mean, the inspector, if he hasn't, will be able to go and have a look at it before review, but it's quite plain that the town centre here has been redeveloped so as to accommodate a very substantial and one might put it normal type large food store, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. I mean, the scheme has been designed with a large food store as what we would call the anchor scheme.
It hasn't been, sorry.
But that isn't uncommon at the town centre development.
Yes, but it hasn't, again, I mean, the inspector will be able to see it and how everything lays out, but it hasn't been one of those where you're trying to shoehorn a superstore into an unusual shape or a difficult site or whatever. It's quite plain that that's quite a decent floor plan for the supermarket of the type that somebody like Sainsbury's wants.
Yes,
with the car parking next to it.
I think it's fair to say it is a redevelopment of an old precinct, and the design has been, the whole scheme has been strongly influenced by the food operators' requirements, or the likely food operators' requirements. I think that's fair to say.
But the position is that even with the benefit of Sainsbury's as an anchor, and I mean, as anchors go, that's a pretty good one for a centre like Urmston, isn't it?
Yes.
Even with the benefit of Sainsbury's as that anchor, there are still substantial amounts of unlet retail units, both in phases 1 and 2, aren't there?
There are, they're recorded in Mrs. Harding's proof.
Yes,
Again, that's not unusual in town centre schemes, particularly in the current plan.
Well, 7 vacant in phase 1 and 3, I think, in phase 2, is that right?
Yeah, that's not unusual.
Well, there we go. Given the efforts that have been made to improve the centre and the area, it is important, isn't it, that development shouldn't then come along to prejudice those improvements?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a consideration whether it's important or not. The point that I made, I think, in my evidence is that yes, you're absolutely right, the council had identified the town centre as being in need of regeneration in the UDP, but it isn't so identified in the core strategy.
Well, you
So
say...
yes, I'm sure the council would like to see continued investment in the centre of Urnston, just as it does in the centre of Sale and Stretford and Alton.
You agree it's a consideration, Mr. Singleton. I think you said whether it's important or not is where you raise a question mark. I do wonder whether actually what you really mean is not so much whether it's important or not, but whether in actual fact it's then outweighed by other matters, because obviously obviously there's a balancing exercise whenever you have one of these sort of situations. But are you saying that issue, that consideration of not prejudicing what's taken place is something that no great weight attaches to, even though it's a consideration?
Well, clearly, as I say, every local authority would want to try and ensure that new development doesn't prejudice investment in other sites and locations and schemes which are already underway. That's clearly a sensible approach for any local planning authority to take. What I'm saying, having regard to the reason for refusal, is the reason for refusal expressly refers to areas which the council have identified as being in need of investment. And in their most current expression of their planning strategic plan, the council doesn't identify those as being in need of particular investment, any more so than any other of its town centres. That's my point. So I would invite the inspector to give weight to that consideration within that context.
Yeah, well, I think I understand the point you're making there, Mr. Singleton. What I think you're saying is that that's a point that goes to the weight to give to this consideration in this case. Yeah.
Yes, I don't say it's immaterial.
Right, thank you very
I
much.
accept that.
Okay. Now, Victoria Parade it is still plainly in need of regeneration, isn't it?
Yes. It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. I think you do suggest that, well, that's what we now see as Victoria Parade is in part at least attributable to the redevelopment of Eden Square.
Sorry,
I think you seem to suggest
Victoria Parade
that
from a new town centre development.
well, I do wonder whether your assessment that Victoria Parade in part at least is the result of the redevelopment of Eden Square is anything more than your view that that's not an unusual occurrence, because I don't think we see any evidence anywhere to explain why the current state of Victoria Parade is a result of the redevelopment of Eden Square, do we?
No, I've not produced any evidence to demonstrate that.
Thank you. But even if it is correct, or were correct, that the current state of Victoria Parade is in part due to Eden Square, that would not actually reduce the need to address the current state of Victoria Parade, would it?
It might actually introduce a new need for the council to reassess what the future role of Victoria Parade is, to reassess where the focus of the town centre now is, and whether it is realistic to expect that to be regenerated as a retail location. And again, that's perfectly common in town centre redevelopment.
But even if that's the case, and I don't, by me asking the question, don't think I'm accepting it's the case, Mr. Singleton, but even if that's the case, that's just another way, again, of saying that in actual fact it will be necessary and important to address the position with Victoria Parade.
Well, certainly, I'm sure the council wants to see investment in Victoria Parade, whatever form that takes. I don't dispute that.
And that will be important for the health of town centre, won't it?
Well, it will be an important contribution to the ongoing health of the town centre.
Now, Woods End Circle also, the local authority is actively promoting a strategy for its regeneration at the moment.
Yes.
And again, that is important for that area, isn't it?
I'm sure it is.
Now, the point you draw our attention to is that neither Woods End Circle nor Elton Town Centre are any longer identified as regeneration priority areas in the core strategy.
Yes.
But that, to an extent, reflects the success of what the council's been doing so far, doesn't it?
I'm sure it does.
It doesn't undermine the need to protect that which it has achieved, or is currently undertaking, does it?
No, I wouldn't disagree with that. But as I said, the point I make is that they are no longer identified
And the fact, well, let's just think about it. If in actual fact you've got the regeneration underway, which we have at Urnston, and albeit at an earlier phase in the line at Woodsend Circle, given that the core strategy is clearly a forward-looking document, you wouldn't expect it to simply reiterate what's been achieved under the UDP, would you?
Well, I would if there was a view based on the most up-to-date evidence that regeneration was still at a fragile state. I certainly would expect that to be the case. In Woodsend Circle in particular was a concern of the council, and I would expect the core strategy to address that.
All right. But as I understand it, whether or not these locations are identified in the development plan, you do not argue that the impact of this proposal upon the regeneration of those areas is an immaterial consideration?
Well, again, it's a consideration that is material to the opinion, but I would invite the inspector to give it extremely little weight, because I don't accept that those areas are in any way particularly vulnerable to the external factors that Mrs. Hartman speaks on, nor indeed do I accept there is any evidence that the proposal is likely to have an adverse impact on those areas.
And indeed, we can see, can't we, that the impact on regeneration is a matter, in some of the other decision letters, for example, that you've drawn our attention to, is a matter that was recognised as a material consideration that the inspector had to assess, and then he came to his view on the evidence.
Yes, it's been addressed by inspectors and line secretary of state.
Okay. Now, can we turn, sorry, I think it's again to your, no, it's your original appendices now, and I think it's the first volume, because it's Mr. Hetherington's report. I think he's at Appendix 3, isn't he?
Yes.
And this is, sorry, it is Mr. Hetherington. This
is Mr. Hetherington.
Yes, I've got that one. Now, I can see, looking at his note paper, that he's based in Lancaster.
Yes.
He doesn't give any indication, as far as I can see, as to the source of his, or first of all, as to his background.
I don't think he does.
Or as to the source of his knowledge.
Well, the source of his knowledge, I think, sorry, when you say his background, he doesn't give his qualifications, doesn't he?
He gives us his qualifications, but I mean, quite frankly, you could have those qualifications and be based in Australia, and you wouldn't really be putting yourself forward as a witness to deal with these matters in this area, would you?
Well, I think it's unlikely if you were based in Australia that you would be doing that, but I think if you're in Lancaster, it's quite likely that you'll be dealing with negotiations and contracts and disposals within the Greater Manchester area. That's
well, it may or may not be. What he doesn't do is give us any indication as to the source of his knowledge, does he? Which is what normally a surveyor wanting to give evidence on these matters would do, isn't it?
Well, I would agree that would be a usual thing to do.
And other than giving us his qualifications at the end of his letter, he doesn't actually tell us what his expertise is, does he?
No.
I mean, for example, you can be a chartered surveyor and a property consultant, but in a particular niche market that would know nothing about these issues, couldn't you?
Well, it could be.
And he just doesn't deign to inform us.
No.
What we can see, the only bit we can see, is he's not locally based.
That's on the letterhead, that's correct.
Yeah. Not in the local area, not even in the conurbation.
Yes.
Or the county.
Within Greater Manchester.
Yeah. Indeed, he's about 60 miles away, isn't he?
Okay, well, I mean, I know where Lancaster is, but I'd rather get on to what he actually says.
Okay, but he gives us no indication that he has any relevant knowledge at all.
He doesn't say that, doesn't he?
anywhere in your evidence or his do we get any explanation as to why there isn't somebody locally based with local knowledge who's giving us evidence? Do we?
No.
And if we just see how the evidence relates to your evidence, you refer to it, I think, in your main proof of evidence, 11.5,
Yes.
I think. And I think that's about, you then summarise bits of it elsewhere, I think, but I think that's all you tell us about Mr. Hetherington also. 11.5.
Yeah, 11.5 on page
67.
Yeah. That's where it is.
Now, if we turn to Mr. Hetherington's letter in Appendix 3, as I understand it, he sets out to demonstrate that the proposal has not had a negative effect on the regeneration of surrounding areas.
Well, he sets out to consider whether it has. That's what he says.
Well, sorry, is that different?
Well, you said he sets out to demonstrate that it hasn't. What he says is it's being prepared to consider whether it would have a detrimental effect.
So, do you think that makes a difference, does it?
Well, I think the implication of your question is approaching the proposed market. I don't think you can read that.
All right, well, if we say he sets out to demonstrate whether the proposal has a negative effect on the regeneration of the surrounding areas, you would agree?
Yes.
All right. And also to consider whether the vitality and self-confidence of the area remains stable.
Yes.
I must confess, you did seem to be saying, the top of page 2, if it can be demonstrated that the proposal has not had a negative effect on the regeneration of the surrounding area. So it did seem to me that's what he was setting out to do, but you tell me that's not right.
Well, I think that's not right. I think in the context of what he said, he's set out at the top of page 2 what he needs to do in order to consider that question.
And he argues, doesn't he, that if you can demonstrate that it hasn't had that effect, then there will be little impact on future regeneration.
Yes.
Sure. In order to determine whether the conditions remain stable, it is of course necessary, isn't it, to undertake a comparison of the position with the current position with the position prior to the relevant event that you are considering.
Prior to the
relevant event that you are considering. If you're going to say, I am looking to see whether the conditions have remained stable, you have to have some comparator to see whether they have remained stable, don't you?
That would be helpful, yes.
Similarly, to demonstrate that there has been no negative impact, you would actually have to, again, undertake a comparison with what the position was before the impact that you say has had no negative impact.
Well, if this was a very detailed study of that kind, then you would have to go back and look at all that information. But again, this was produced in response to the reason for refusal. And he set out what he has done.
Yeah.
And the inspector must accept it on that basis.
Well, what he hasn't actually done is undertake any such comparative assessment, has he?
Well, he's looked at the developments which have been consented over a period of time, some of which were consented before the announcement of Peel's proposals and some after, and he's looked at what has happened with those proposals.
He hasn't looked at what the position was before Peel's proposals and compared it with the position after.
He hasn't done an assessment of, for example, what the housing sales were prior to that.
So, the very fundamental thing he'd have to do in order to establish what he says he's setting out to do, he has not done, has he?
Well, no, I don't accept that. I think he has provided a report which has looked at all of the proposals which are known about within this location to see if there is any indication, any evidence that they have been adversely affected. And I'm sure he's basing that on his experience of the wider, his knowledge of the wider area. I'm certain he will have a knowledge of Greater Manchester if he's based on that kind of stuff. And his own experience of how development proposals are being progressed in the region as well.
if he'd come here to be cross-examined, we could have tested him on that, but I'm having to do the best we can on what we've got here, which is all the evidence we have, Mr. Singleton, from you. And we do not see anywhere, as you have agreed, a comparison of the conditions before the appeal proposal with after.
I've agreed that's not set out.
Which you have agreed is what we would need to see to determine whether conditions remain stable.
I've agreed it would be helpful to see that.
Well, how can we do the assessment without it, Mr. Singleton?
Well, you can assess it on, as Mr. Hevington's done, on the basis of informed judgment from somebody who is active in the sector, looking with his knowledge, as I'm sure any other commercial surveyor would do, of the market generally, of the market in the North West, and what is happening in and around the area.
Well, if we are to trust him as Moses coming down from the mountain with his tablet of material, Mr. Singleton, that would be another reason why it would be very valuable to actually see what his source of knowledge is and his background, isn't it?
Well, I agree with that.
And indeed, we are therefore left, aren't we, with the position that even if we accept all that he says, he hasn't actually done what he told us he'd set himself out to do.
Well, I think he has within the context of the approach he's set out and the information that he's set out. He's told us what the information sources are that he has used. I think we can assume that he's exercised his professional experience and judgment in assessing what has happened, and he's come to the conclusions that he's come to.
Well, given that he hasn't undertaken the comparison to enable us to see whether there has been a negative effect or whether the conditions remain stable, given he hasn't undertaken that comparison, he is not able to say.
But I think
that
we've gone over that ground, so as I say, I'd like to.
If he hasn't done that, Mr. Singleton, it also follows, doesn't it, that the foundation for his proposition that there will be little impact on future regeneration has not been made out.
I don't agree with that reason at all.
Listen to my hypothetical question, Mr. Singleton. If he has not established that the conditions have remained stable and there has been no negative impact, he will not have established the foundation for his argument that there will be no impact in the future, will he?
I don't agree with that position. The reason
Are you telling me you don't agree with that as a proposition, or you don't agree with that as the position in this case?
Well, what I said is, I accept he hasn't done a study of the conditions prior to the point at which he starts and the various schemes that I'm going through. I can't tell you what the first stage of the planning commission is that he's reviewed, but certainly they go back a few years. So he is looking at whether or not those schemes have been progressed within the timescale that we've been looking at, and whether there is any indication, based on his knowledge and experience of the market, that those schemes have been adversely affected to any extent whatsoever by the proposals. I think that's a perfectly fair thing for him to do. And on that basis, I think he can make that judgment.
Right. Now, would you please deal with my question, Mr. Singleton?
Well, I think if your proposition or hypothetical question implies that it is necessary to do that in order to make any judgment at the time that he's making, then the answer is yes. But I don't accept that.
It's not my hypothetical proposition, it's his statement at the top of page 2 of his statement, isn't it?
Well, with respect, Fraser, I think we're going over the same point.
Yes. His statement, let's just look at it again, just so that we're clear, because I want to be fair to you in my closing submissions, Mr. Singleton. His statement is, if, hypothetical, it can be demonstrated that the proposal has not had a negative effect on the regeneration of the surrounding area since being publicised, and that the vitality and self-confidence of the area remains stable, then it could be argued that it would have little impact on future regeneration. Now, in the terms he has set himself out, if he has not established that there has not been a negative effect and that there has not been an impact on the vitality and self-confidence of the area, in his own terms, he will not be able to argue that there will be little future impact, will he?
Well, that only follows if it is accepted that you have to do a baseline study in order to reach that judgment. Clearly, that isn't what he's done.
Well, he hasn't done that. But if
he has demonstrated that there has been significant interest and uptake of units within the town centre by international multi-retailers. That certainly reflects in terms of vitality. He has demonstrated that there has been significant uptake and very good sales in terms of the residential schemes that we've looked at, which certainly indicates good self-confidence and vitality. So that's the information that's in front of the inspector. That's the basis on which he makes his judgment.
We're going to look at that in a moment, Mr. Singleton. We're going to look at it in a moment.
But that is the basis of his judgment.
But in the terms in which he set out his assessment as to how he was going to establish the proposition, if he does not establish that there's not a negative effect and there has been an impact on vitality and self-confidence, then he is not in a position to argue, as he said he would be, that there would be little impact on future regeneration, is he?
Well, if you accept that proposition that that's necessary in order to demonstrate, then that is correct.
Okay. But of course, again, if we just look at that proposition, the proposition is that if you can show that there hasn't been a negative impact so far in advance of a planning permission, then there will be no negative impact if the development were to proceed. That's what he's saying there, isn't it?
That's the assumption that's underpinning that. Yes.
What evidence do we have to justify such an assumption?
Well, we have the evidence which has been looked at in respect of all the other appeal decisions and the evidence of the studies that have been conducted.
Yeah. Well, what evidence do we have to establish the assumption that if there hasn't been an impact in advance of the grant of planning permission, there won't be an impact later?
Well, it's a judgment. I accept it's a judgment.
So it's just a judgment, just an assumption in other words.
It seems to me to be a perfectly sound judgment.
Yeah, it's an assumption, effectively, isn't it?
It's a judgment.
Again, as it's a judgment, it isn't something that is self-evidently correct or established, is it?
It isn't proved in an empirical way, no.
And of course, do bear with me, this seems a silly question. But prior to the grant of planning permission, the development cannot proceed, can it?
No.
There is no certainty that any development will obtain planning permission, is there?
No.
And of course, the local planning authority position and that of the local community is quite clear. They don't think that this should be allowed, do they?
It's clear.
And also is being vigorously resisted.
It has.
Okay. So anybody assessing the position at the moment would not assume that consent would be granted, would they?
I don't know that. I mean, they'll be aware that there is an appeal, no doubt. Anybody looking at this in the run-up to, between the planning decision and today would be likely to expect that people would pursue an appeal against this. So I think they'd assume that the outcome is still unknown.
So they'd assume the outcome's unknown. I think that would be a known unknown, according to Mr. Welchwell. Of course, even if it were granted planning permission, that still doesn't mean it will definitely be implemented, does it? There's still a degree of uncertainty.
Well, it doesn't, but as we've seen in the other appeal decisions, I think the very fact of a major developer investing a substantial amount of resource, both financial and in terms of person input, if we can use that term, to pursue a proposal, demonstrates a very serious intention for it to go ahead. It has a permit, so that is well known within the local area. So that is one of the major barriers to its going ahead.
Okay. Does the Interplants have a permit yet?
I don't believe so. I've not had any involvement in Interplant.
No. And how long ago was it consented?
It's in the papers. I can't tell you off the top of my head.
But because it's only if the development were to proceed that it will have an impact, isn't it?
Well, no, I don't accept that.
Sorry, sorry. I've probably put the question very badly. It's only if the development were to proceed that it will actually have an impact upon the surrounding area in the sense of it being there and the emissions that we've been discussing, you know, the other matters consequent upon actually having built construction there.
Well, I think we're discussing reason 1 here, and you'll know that my case is that it won't have a negative impact on the investment in those areas. So again, I treat your question as being hypothetical. Once it is known about that the permission has been granted and that it goes ahead and is implemented, I suspect actually the likely impact would be reduced over time, because it will be there, people will become accustomed to it, and they'll recognise that it's not actually having the impacts which they fear.
The local authority's refusal is based upon the impact on Davyhulme, Flixton and Elmsted, isn't it?
It is.
Mr. Hetherington actually looks at a wider area, doesn't he?
He includes, I think he includes Coles Hill as well.
Yeah.
And he also takes into account the wards in Salford.
Yeah, he tells us that again, it's on page 2.
He looks at a wider context.
It's on page 2.
Yes, on page
well,
2.
he acknowledges that the planning refusal is addressing effects on Davyhulme, Flixton and Elmsted, but he actually then goes on to look at a different area, albeit that they are included within that different area.
He looks at a wider area, I think, rather than a different area.
Well, looking at a wider area doesn't of itself address the council's reasons for refusal.
Well, if he had ignored Flixton and Davyhulme, east and west, then that would be true, but he hasn't.
Well, if you look at a wider area, you run, at the very least, the risk of diluting any impact, don't you?
Well, I don't think so. If your suggestion is that there are schemes in Flixton and Davyhulme that he has ignored in his assessment, then that would be true, but I don't think that is the case.
If we go back to my question, if you look at a wider area, including an area beyond which anybody's arguing there will be an impact, you run the risk, do you not, of diluting any impact which there will be?
No, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's the way the report is constructed.
Okay. Now, at the bottom of page 2, he then tells us how he's splitting up the findings between, I think it's the post-application, or post-consultation, I think post-consultation with respect to the application, and then the post-application period up to September of this year.
Yes.
And he says, I thought it would be beneficial to determine whether regeneration was limited after the formal application was submitted. After undertaking the exercise, it appears the formal planning application didn't negatively affect regeneration activity. So the only comparison I think he's doing there is whether there's he can see a difference between the impact, or the situation, I should say, post-announcement of or consultation on the proposal, and then post-submission of the application.
Yes.
But he doesn't actually tell us how or why he comes to the conclusion that there wasn't any negative effect even over that period.
Well, if he doesn't tell us, we assume that's based on the review that he's carried out.
Yeah. There's no analysis and no comparisons as such, is there?
No.
Yeah. And then he refers us over the page on page 3 to the application split between wards over those 2 dates set out in Appendix 1.
Yes.
And if we wanted to, we could go and look at them, but
I think all the applications, relevant application information is there.
Yeah, I don't suspect we need to look at them for these purposes, but if you want us to, we can.
Yeah.
But again, he doesn't tell us anything about how he's taken them into account, or how or why we should draw any conclusions.
So what? I don't understand.
Appendix 1, all the documents he's produced in Appendix 1, he's put them there, but he doesn't then tell us how he's taken them into account.
Well, he's taken into account to understand the content of the proposals, I think, the content of the scheme.
Of which scheme?
Of all the schemes
Yeah.
he's addressed.
But yeah, he
That's
doesn't
the
tell us.
source of information as to what the content and nature of the development proposal is, what date was it consented.
He doesn't tell us what he's done with that information, does he?
Well, I think that's the conclusion that we should draw from that.
What conclusion?
That he's used that information. What he's done is to interrogate the planning application database to find out what schemes were being proposed and consented within the timescale that he's looked at.
Yeah.
So it's a source of raw information, raw data.
Well, I know, but the problem with raw data is you then have to do something with it, don't you? Because the raw data doesn't of itself give you an answer. You then have to do some sort of analysis with it, don't you?
Well, what he's done with it is to identify the schemes which he ought to consider and review. He's assembled information as to what the content and nature of those schemes are. He's got information as to when those schemes were consented, and then he's looked at marketing and sales information to see how those schemes have progressed or not progressed. Well,
I'm interested that you tell us that's what he's done, because I don't actually see where he does that at all in his report.
Well, if we look at the first one, it says applications submitted by As Property commenced in January. Before.
Sorry, what are we looking at?
Registered on the 17th of August. Planning approved on the 15th of December. That information is in the appendix, and the information is extracted from the council's planning system.
Sorry, hang on a minute. What one are we looking at?
Well, the very first.
Oh, sorry, phase 2, commercial development. Right.
And he does that under all examples. He tells us when the application was registered, when it was determined, if there's a reserve notice, when that was pursued.
Well,
I think that is the information that, in Appendix 1 it says planning applications.
Well, that's very interesting, because if that's what you're telling us he's done with it, it means he's actually disregarded quite a selection of the applications that are within Appendix 1.
So he's disregarded
quite a selection of the applications within Appendix. He's only dealt with some of them then, is what you're telling us.
Well, I'm sure he's extracted those for his report, those which he thinks are most relevant in terms of the location.
Right. Well, you see, he doesn't actually tell us anywhere, as far as I can see, what his analysis was or why we should draw any conclusions from that. Are you going to point out where he does that?
He's set out his understanding of the key schemes which are being promoted in the vicinity of the location, and he's looked at how they have progressed both through the planning process and in implementation. He's looked at how the market has responded to them in terms of sales and take-up, and he's formed his judgment on that basis.
Okay. Well, let's just
be a perfectly reasonable thing for him to have done.
Let's just then look at the situation then. Phase 2, sorry, Eden Square, Phase 2. What we have to bear in mind, I think, is that Phase 1 of Eden Square was granted planning permission back in 2006, wasn't it?
I understand so.
And that included the Sainsbury's.
Phase 1 was anchored by the Sainsbury's.
Yeah. And we've discussed the position with respect to Phase 1. Development required amending, and then not all the retail units have been let. That's correct.
Yes, and he tells us again it's being let to national multiple retailers.
Yeah. And then Phase 2, we can see that there was an application in 2010 and approved in December 2010.
Yes.
And again, I think that had to be redesigned, that Phase 2 even.
I think we're told that by Mrs. Harding. I think I've no reason to dispute that, but again, I would say that's perfectly common practice over the last 4 to 5 years for those few schemes that have been progressed.
What we were also told by Mrs. Harding, and I don't think there's any issue about it, is that pre-lets were necessary in order to enable Phase 2 to proceed.
I'm sure that's true. Any developer would struggle to get funding to implement without seeking to do that position.
But what we don't know is when the pre-lets were achieved, although clearly they must have been achieved before January 2012.
Well, we don't know that, as you say.
So we don't know, for example, whether the pre-lets were pre the period that Mr. Hallage is looking at.
Well, a reason which I can't share with the inquiry, because I have acted for one of these retailers. I'm very confident that the pre-let was under discussion for a long time, but it was only signed shortly before the commencement of Phase 2.
Before the commencement of Phase 2? Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm struggling a bit sometimes.
I can't go there because that would be...
Okay, well, I don't want to embarrass you, Mr. Singleton. Traffic keys. The application there was made in October 2010.
Yes.
That hasn't been determined.
It's been resolved and granted, there is still a 106p conflict.
So it's the 106 that's holding that up.
Yes.
Which I think actually is in the hands of another sort of part of appeal, I'm sure, is it?
It's appeal proposal, yes, part of appeal group.
Yeah. So all that we know is that there was an application made by another part of appeal group in October 2010, which has not received the planning permission yet because there's still an issue about section 106 of it.
I think I'm not party to the discussions on the 106. One of my colleagues is doing that, but there are one or two issues still to be resolved on detailed content of 106. There are no major issues in principle. There is a resolution to grant permission for that.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't really tell us anything about market interest as such. I mean, all it tells us, in fact, is that whatever the situation, and it may be market interest or it may be other matters, whatever the situation is, that there hasn't been the ability yet to reach agreement on section 106.
Well, it tells us that, but it also tells us that Peel were prepared to invest a significant amount of time and resource, again, in preparing that application. We've had two applications, one is for the residential, one is for the commercial, and all of the reports that needed to be submitted with that application. So, going back to the point which was looked at in other appeal decisions, that does demonstrate an ongoing confidence from that other part of Peel in terms of investment in the area. Clearly what they are doing is preparing that site ready to go to the market at the appropriate time. And why would they do that if they didn't think that there was going to be a market demand at the end of the day?
Help me on this, sorry. The Trafford Quays proposal, is that, if we go back to the question of the spatial profile in the core strategy, is that within the area that's identified as Trafford Park spatial?
Yes, it's within the Trafford Centre area.
Yeah, I thought it was. So it's within the Trafford Park area in the spatial profile. So when we see it described here as Elmston, it isn't actually Elmston according to core strategy.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. And
I wouldn't refer to it being in Elmston.
Well, that's
I haven't done in all the years I've been dealing with it.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Singh. So that isn't actually, that is one of the locations that isn't actually within the authority's area of concern.
Well, no, it's a location which is in very similar proximity to a proposed rep.
That point I understand. But if we go back to the areas that the authority are concerned with, which were Davyhulme, Flixton and Elmston, it's not within them, is it?
No, it's not.
And likewise, when we then look at the remainder of the commercial development and market activity, none of them are within the area that the authority has expressed concern about.
They're within that wider area, but we've already discussed that. It seems to me perfectly reasonable that you would look at the wider area and see whether proposals are being affected by investment proposals, marketing of those sites is being affected by the proposal.
I think it would also be fair to, and I suspect the inspector again will have formed his own judgment already on that, coming and going, so to speak, but I think it would be fair to say that Trafford Park and the area where all of these sites are is quite different in character and environment to Elmston, Flixton and Davyhulme, isn't it?
I suspect we're going over part of what we discussed yesterday. In terms of the profile area that we looked at. Yes, Trafford Park has a different distinctive profile and a character. And what we were talking about yesterday was the degree to which that character extends beyond the motorway into the site location, the treatment works, and the retail parts.
As you say, we don't need to go into it.
So if we turn then to the next page where he moves on to deal with residential development and market activity, he deals with Barton Cross,
yes.
which if we just go to Appendix 4, we can see is site 5, isn't it? Your Appendix 4, sorry, your Appendix 4. You've very helpfully produced I think an airspace map.
So I was just getting confused because there are appendices.
You are right, I'm sorry about that. It's your Appendix 4.
Which one is it, Mr. Singleton? I'm not sure.
It's probably a white tab Appendix 4 there. There's a whole pile of coloured ones.
Yeah.
And then you go beyond them, just beyond them, and there's a white tab Appendix 4. There should be a
yeah.
pull-out
Yeah,
OS
yes,
plan.
thank you.
And it may be useful if you just pull that out and leave it pulled out.
Thank you.
It's a bullet A3 plan, so you can see from the key, the one that Mr. Fraser has
Sure.
referred to,
Yeah,
number
that's
5.
It's number 5, isn't it? Barton
Yeah.
Cross, and I think to be fair, it is the site that is, of all of these, that is the closest,
Yeah.
possibly with the exception of 2, actually, to be fair, looking at it. But
No, well, it depends where you measure from.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of the main body on the site, I think this is closer.
this is probably the closest, yeah. Well, again, it's a matter
Number
of...
2 is the Traffic Keys one.
It's a matter of impression looking at the plan, but I'm not...
Traffic Keys is actually a very large site, so you know the number 2 is broadly in the centre of that site.
Well, that's the other thing, I think,
Yeah.
actually. I think the circles here are giving a very good indication as to where they are, but they're not precisely
No,
accurate.
they're not showing the site boundary of the
Now, can you just tell me on Barton Cross, do you have any knowledge yourself of Barton Cross beyond what Mr. Hetherington says?
No.
I didn't think you did. And again, this is another one where Mr. Hetherington doesn't actually tell us what his source of knowledge is, does he?
Well, I think we can assume that he's looked at sales data insofar as that's accessible to him.
Yeah, but we don't know how accessible it is to him, or what it is he's looked at.
Well, we can only see what he has said.
Yeah.
He's got the information about what the sales have been undertaken. He's got information about the rate of sales and the prices of those sales.
Well, he doesn't have information of the prices of the sales. He has information as to what the asking price
Yes,
is.
I agree with that. Absolutely.
The marketing.
Yes.
So he doesn't actually tell us what the sale prices achieved were.
Well, on the basis, no, he doesn't tell you what the actual sale price is.
And he doesn't give us any indication as to what, if any, incentives there may have been.
No.
Nor does he give us any real comparison of prices and sales anywhere else, does he?
Well, only in relation to the 7 scheme, I think. No, sorry, the Caddy's scheme.
With Cadishead. Well, that was the only one I thought he could possibly be referring
That's the
to.
comparison he makes.
Yeah, so it's Cadishead
Yeah.
that's relied on. Okay. And that's the only sales that are being relied upon and take any comparison as to
That's
whether...
the comparison he makes between those 2 schemes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So if we're to check, if we turn to the end of his report, at page 7, I've numbered the pages.
They're not numbered. This is
So,
the sign.
no.
This is the sign page.
Yes, the sign page. I'm sorry, I have sort of
Yeah.
numbered them, but it's the
Yeah.
last one. Underneath the bullet point on the, on the top of the page, he tells us that Persimmon Barton Cross achieved a sales rate of, requesting sales prices of,
Yes.
this site has sold quicker and commanded greater sale prices than other competing corporate house builder sites which are similar product character and scale within the locality.
Yes.
That's a comparison with Cadishead.
I think the main comparison is with Caddy's, yes.
Well, there isn't anything else we can see at all, is there? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, if we're going to try to check at all his assertion there, we have to do it by comparing with Cadishead.
Yes.
But of course, again, there's no comparison anywhere with what was the situation with respect to sales rates or sales prices in anywhere prior to the announcement of the appeal proposal.
No.
And so it's impossible to form any judgment as to whether the announcement of the appeal proposal has had any impact upon sales rates or prices compared with what was happening before, isn't it?
No, that assessment is not done in this.
What we can see, of course, if we go back to, it's the 4th page where he summarises Barton Cross, is that this is a long-standing proposal, isn't it?
It is.
It's,
well, I think, yes, May 2007.
yeah, it was originally submitted long before the biomass plan was known about in May 2007.
Yes.
And then Reserved Matters was approved in May 2011.
Yes.
Which would be, I think, to be fair, after knowledge of the biomass plan.
I think that was after the announcement.
After the application, even actually.
Yeah, the July 10 was the initial public consultation. So it's sometimes some considerable time after this.
Yeah, yeah. Although we're not.
It's after the second round and after the application.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I said to you,
yes.
What we're not told, because all we're told is the Reserved Matters approval was on the 11th of May. And what we're not told is what or when the Reserved Matters application was made. Or are you telling us we can find that out from Appendix 1?
Well, I think
you might be right. Actually, I didn't really think.
I think it is, but I don't want to waste it.
Well, all right. Well, I can have a look outside. If it's there at all, it'll be in Appendix 1.
Yeah.
I can look myself. Don't worry. You might be right.
I can't see where he would have got that information from other than through the process.
Yeah, you may be right on that one, Mr. Singleton. What we don't know, of course, for example, is the permission having been obtained in May of 2007, and the Reserved Matters we can then see having been approved in May of 2011. Yeah. We don't know when Persimmon were contractually bound to this site, do we?
No.
Although it's pretty unlikely that they wouldn't have had their position secured before they got the Reserved Matters approval.
I really don't know. It depends upon the circumstances of the site, it depends upon the nature of their contract, all sorts of reasons. And obviously, having achieved an outline permission in May 2011 wasn't very good timing in terms of the market position.
Well, that we can understand, and that may be an explanation for the delay. I understand.
I suspect that is a significant factor.
I can understand that, Mr. Singleton. But in actual fact, what we don't know, of course, is at all from this information is whether, in truth, Persimmon were past the point of no return before the biomass proposal came on the scene, do we?
Well, past the point of no return in terms of buying the site or in terms of progressing the development.
We just don't know, do we?
Well, my experience of house builders is that yes, they might be contractually obliged to buy the site on the basis of, let's assume, for example, it was a contract which is conditional upon getting an appropriate planning permission, and that might well have triggered completion on the acquisition. That does not, in my experience, commit the house builder then to progress with the scheme.
Now, if we then see the comparison he makes, if we go back to your OS plan in your Appendix 4, the Cadder's Head scheme is, it's almost fallen off the plan, in fact.
Well, I think he tells us, doesn't he, how far it's 3 miles, I think.
Well, it's site 15, isn't it?
Yeah, it's site 15.
Site 15.
Tailwind one. Yeah.
Sorry?
Red Road, Tailwind.
Yeah, and it actually, it does fall off the plan, really, because I think the very northern edge of the site is just on the plan.
Yes.
But we can see that it's in a different local authority area, on the other side of the canal.
I don't think it's in a different area.
It's in Salford, isn't it, Cadder's Head? It's in Salford.
Sorry, it is on that side. Sorry, yes, it's on that
with
side.
With your 29 years knowledge of the area.
Sorry, I was just looking at where it is. It is just on the north side of the canal.
Yeah, it's in Salford, isn't it?
Salford, yes.
Well, you know Cadder's Head is in Salford.
Yes. I didn't say I spent 29 years in Salford.
No.
Much of that would be a pleasure.
No, but you do have a lot of knowledge of this area, you were telling us. Yes. And where do we see any analysis as to whether Cadder's Head in Salford, which we can see is quite a distance away from the conurbation, is a comparable market whatsoever?
Well,
with St Flixton or...
Yeah, that analysis isn't there, but what we see on this plan is an indication of those schemes which were consented in the period of looking at. And what that tells us is that there were very few schemes consented in the Trafford part of the area.
Yeah, but no, he's doing the comparison here.
Yes.
To say, look, sales rate's better, asking price better,
Yes.
although he doesn't tell us sales price.
Well, yes, I assume he's not had access to that because that would have been presumed sensitive information.
Well, we know that if in actual fact the surveyor were doing this sort of information to give any meaningful evidence as to what prices were, he'd need to have proper knowledge and be able to prove, if required to, what the actual prices achieved were.
Well, if he could access that information, yes, he would.
Well, if he was somebody who was familiar with the area, he'd have it, wouldn't he?
Well, he may do.
The Hayes Green site.
Sorry, the...
Hayes Green site. Cadishead.
Yes.
It's a reclaimed chemicals works, isn't it?
I think it's part of that site, yes.
Yeah, it's a reclaimed chemical works, which took an awfully long time to reclaim, didn't it?
Yes.
A very contaminated site. As we can see from the plan, or the map, immediately to the north, there's a very extensive industrial park, and indeed industrial park is how it is marketed on the ground.
Yes.
And immediately to the south of the Hayes Green site we have other industry, don't we?
Yes, it's an industrial area.
It's a very industrial area, and indeed the only reason I think that we've got residential development there at all in reality is it was about the only way to try to get some financing to reclaim the site, wasn't it?
I don't know. Can't commit.
Isn't it just a little bit likely that the history of that site and its location in amongst industry on both sides, and perhaps the inspector may want to go and see it if he needs to, isn't it just a little bit likely that might affect sales and sales rates and prices?
I don't disagree that the context is different, and that is one of the factors that might affect the sales. Certainly sales prices, whether it would affect sales rates, I really don't know. If there is a demand in that area for that housing, then it may not affect it. It may not be such an influence on the rates of sale. It might certainly be an influence on the prices.
Somebody who knew the local area would be aware of all of that history, wouldn't they, Mr.
Yes.
And if they were giving evidence to an inquiry to say, this is the comparison I'm doing, Davyhulme, Brixton and Urmston, I think it would be beholden on them just to explain that background a little bit, wouldn't it?
I'm sure you won't put that question to him.
What?
I'm sure you won't put that question.
Well, I think Mr. Hetherington should have explained all of that before he gives us this assertion that if one looks at the comparators of similar product character and scale within the locality, we're doing well here.
But that is the basis on which he makes his comparison in terms of similar products and scale.
Not similar area.
But I accept there are differences between the two areas.
I thought it was location that ultimately determined all of these matters, as did Mr. Singleton.
Well, that's not my area of expertise, Mr. Craig.
But it is Mr. Hetherington's, if he has expertise in this field. And we'd expect him to address that critical question of location, wouldn't we?
Well, he hasn't done so.
Pardon?
He hasn't done so.
No, he hasn't done so, which is...
Okay, well, I'll go and look at Cadishead.
Yes, I'd like you to do that, so see whether or not the description has just been applied.
And I will look at other sites as well. And I'll do that. I mean, I know that there's a programme of accompanied site visits, but not all of these need to be accompanied, and that sort of thing I can do unaccompanied.
Just to put my position on that, sir, I am familiar with the Cadishead area generally. I'm not familiar with this particular site.
So that fundamental point about location is just not addressed anywhere in Mr. Hetherington's.
No, he doesn't use that as part of his assessment of the regions.
Well, in reality then, having not addressed that fundamental issue, the inspector really does not have the material in front of him, does he, to demonstrate that the sales achieved at Barton Cross were actually good compared to elsewhere that is really comparable.
Well, he has the comparison with the Cadishead scheme. That's what he has in front of him.
Okay, now, if we then go back to the residential development and market activity page 4 of his letter.
So we go back to page 4.
4 of Mr. Hetherington's letter. That Calder Court proposal, I think you give a little bit more information about, don't you? If we turn to your proof at page 69.
Page
69.
69.
You've got a section there, public sector residential investment.
Yes.
And then you've got Trafford Housing Trust, Calder Court, and that's the same site, isn't it, you were talking about?
That's the site, yes.
And you very helpfully let us know there, very properly, that it's actually part of a bigger, significant development.
Yes.
Where 198 affordable homes has been, not in this particular location, but is being provided over the wider area.
Yes, in a partnership.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's part of this sort of scheme to deliver affordable homes in Sale, Old Trafford, Davyhulme, homes.
Yes, and I think this scheme is both for shared ownership and for private housing.
Yeah.
It's a combination of exclusively affordable.
And just bear with me a moment, sorry. Yes, if we turn to Mr. Hetherington's Appendix 1, I'm afraid the pages aren't numbered here either, so it's not that easy. But if we look at Appendix 1, the first part deals with Davyhulme East.
Yes.
And the second part then deals with Davyhulme East, which is the second period he's looking at. And if you go beyond that, we then get, I think, to Davyhulme West.
Yeah.
And the first bit deals with up to December 2010, and the second part then is Davyhulme West, December 2010 onwards.
Yes.
If we turn to that bit, I think this site is the second of the pages within that. Sound right?
Well, there are two, aren't there, that relate to Calder Court. The first one was withdrawn.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, that's the other. Sorry, you're quite right. The first one. That's the other complicating factor we've got to bear in mind with this list of
Yes.
decisions, because he's put everything in. So we have ones, as you just pointed out, that are withdrawn, or we have ones that are just small variations of something else, effectively, don't we?
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
But
The first one was withdrawn. The second one was approved.
the approved one, we can actually see the description of the proposal there, can't we? Which is demolition of existing 30 bungalows, erection of 33 2, 3, 4-bedroom detached, semi-detached with works ancillary thereto, incorporating 16 two-storey and 17 two-storey with accommodation in the roof space.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was redevelopment of a site that already had 30 units on it to provide 33, wasn't it?
Yes.
Was it a local authority site?
I don't know.
I should have checked that with my clients, I suppose, actually. Yeah, I should have checked that with my clients, I suppose.
Yeah.
We don't know.
I can't tell you, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I don't.
I think it probably was.
It strikes me as it probably was.
Well, given the location, I suspect it is.
Yeah.
It was a.
Yeah.
When we say local authority, it's probably not under management of the local authority now. But
No, it was probably formerly, but it'd be some sort of public sector ownership.
Sort of third arm arrangement, I would guess.
That's
my knowledge of the area. I think it's in that sort of.
That was the impression I gained also, Mr. Singh. That's very helpful. I mean, the point I'm really putting to you is that this is effectively the public sector social housing scheme.
It is.
And indeed, to be fair to you, you put it under that heading, really, public sector residential investment, don't you?
Yes.
And it's very clear that there is a need for affordable housing and other social housing in this area, isn't there?
Yep.
And indeed we can actually see, I think again, this is one that's got a bit of a history because we not only was there a withdrawn application which you've drawn our attention to, but I think the applications originally started off here in about 2009, didn't they? I can't remember where I can't remember where I got the information for that note now. Actually, so
the withdrawn application is dated September 2011. Withdrawn on in November. So, and it seems as though that actually was I think maybe what's happened looking at the description is that the scheme has changed.
Okay.
So maybe they submitted two schemes and then decided to go with one. I don't know.
Perhaps it doesn't really.
But I don't know that.
Perhaps it
doesn't. Prior to 2011.
Yeah. Don't worry. Perhaps it doesn't matter. I'm not quite sure where I got that information from now. So. But I mean, given that this is clearly a public sector social housing scheme in a situation where there's very clear pressing need for it on a site that really seems to be public sector housing anyway, it's not really telling us an awful lot about the market, is it?
Well, it's telling us about the willingness of not just the council or the trust, but also its partners to kind of carry on investing in this area. And it's also telling us about the take-up of those properties by people who have now moved into them.
Well, yes, but again, if there's a pressing need for that type of accommodation, people often don't really have a choice where they move into. They're just going to take what's available.
Sometimes they don't. I agree with that. But there clearly has been a very rapid take-up of those units.
And sadly, again, that type of accommodation, I know government policy seeks to achieve otherwise now, but that type of accommodation often ends up where nothing else will go residentially, doesn't it?
That's not government policy.
I know it's not government policy, but
I'm sure that doesn't happen.
Much as government may strive not to do it, that is sadly still what happens, isn't it?
Well, I think it's fair to say that where local authorities and/or their partners are redeveloping areas which have been previously or currently are public sector housing, and use that in the broadest term, then they would have an eye to looking to see what sort of provision should be put back there, and affordable would be very high in that consideration.
Thank you. Now, if we then go, oops, sorry, I've gone too far. If we then go back to the text of Mr. Heathcote's report or letter, his next scheme there is land adjacent to Nag's Head Pub.
Yes.
It says sheltered housing scheme, I think.
That's a shelter scheme.
Again, there's a clear need for such housing.
Yes, but again, it's a commercial developer, so it's subject to all the investment decisions we've spoken about previously.
And I think there's been no decision state on that one, is that right?
That's what we are told.
Yeah. So it's
I
not actually.
haven't checked.
Yeah, it hasn't actually.
Since then, but certainly when he wrote this report, that was the position.
It hasn't actually progressed any further. But Bowfell Road Depot then is the next one. That's again we can see it's a housing association.
Yes.
It predates the appeal proposal, I think, doesn't it?
We're told here registered in July 2012. And planning approved. That can't be right, can it? There seems to be maybe a transfer of the date.
I think it's 2010, somebody's telling me.
It's in the appendix.
Is it? It'll be in, which one's it in?
Bowfell Road. Yes, it is. It's in Davyhulme West. I think this is the right one. It's in the second part. No, sorry, it's in Flixton. It's the first one in Flixton.
Then after Davyhulme West.
After Davyhulme West, yes. I think that is the one. Check the reference. 75601. Yeah.
both of those
It's the first one in the Flixton section.
Yeah.
And you're right, it says that the application was registered in July 2010.
Yeah.
And then it was approved. I just wonder whether there was that's all that it tells us.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, we don't know the circumstances that resulted in the timescale of implementation, the time lag between approval and implementation.
And then if we go over the page, we're back to Trafford Quays, because as you explained, Trafford Quays is both commercial and residential proposal.
Sorry, just to completeness, Mr. Trainer, because you raised it in relation to Trafford Quays. It seems there the date of the committee was October of 2010, but the decision date is actually end of March 2011. So again, I assume that there were maybe some other agreements or 106 or something between those two dates. So that's when the decision was issued, March of 2011.
Okay, that's fair enough. Just bear with me a second, just check something. Sorry, but then if we go back to the report, we're back to Trafford Quays, and that's the residential element of this development that we were talking before, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't think that raises anything new as such.
Yes, he has, I think, looked at the residential. As I said in my evidence, there was also an application for BCO grade A office accommodation at the same time, which was determined and resolved to grant at the same time.
And then we've finally got the Arndale Properties Management Scheme in Eccles.
Yes, sorry.
Which is, sorry?
Yes, Arndale. Yeah.
Yeah. Which obviously Eccles is outside the area that the authority was raising concerns about the reason for refusal.
Yes.
And indeed, we get a feel for where it is if we turn again to the OS plan. It's site number 10, I think, that one.
I should have kept the plan open.
Sorry, yeah, I did that. It's the easiest way to get back to it quickly.
Yes. Yep.
That site I do know. I had a job as a student delivering
Ah!
commercial stores.
We won't ask you to give evidence, sir. Anyway, so you'll know where it is, sir. I think that one, the application was made about the same time, effectively, as the appeal proposal. I think the application for the appeal proposal was about the same time.
Well, it says December 2010. And Mr. Harrington says on the first page of the letter that the first consultation was advertised in July, the second consultation in November.
Yeah.
And yes, the application is 2nd of December. So,
yeah. So it's about contemporaneous, roughly.
Yeah.
And it hasn't proceeded as I understand it, although we're told the site has been cleared.
That's what it tells us, yes.
Yeah. So again, it's outside the area the authority is raising concern about. It hasn't proceeded, and indeed it's an application that was made about the same time as this appeal application.
Yes.
What does it tell us about the market?
Well, I don't think it tells you anything about the market. I think it's relevant to refer to it because, as we see, there are very few applications being promoted within the three wards that the council is concerned about. So what Mr. Harrington has done is to look at other proposals within a similar distance of the site. And all this tells us is that the applicant has progressed the scheme within that timescale.
Now, just skipping from Mr. Hetherington for a moment to your proof, Mr. Singleton, page 69. I think just for completeness, you do raise a couple of other sites there, which I don't think that Mr. Hetherington does. Page 69, on the public sector residential investment side.
Barton Village.
Yes, sorry, Barton Village you raised.
Yeah, the one's going over the page.
And then there's one over the page in East as well. Barton, Eccles, and indeed the Eccles New Road and East, which is over the page, both of those again, we can agree are outside the areas identified as of concern by this report.
Yes, I don't think those, for that reason, they're not numbered on, are they numbered on the plan?
Oh, they may be, I don't know.
I know they are, they're 12, site number 12 and 13, I think.
Oh, that's very helpful, thank you. Yeah.
So the inspector can see where those are in relation to the site.
Yeah, thank you. And then if we just look at the Barton Village one, that is effectively regenerating existing blocks of flats, isn't it?
Yes, it's I think it's part of the family life area. Certainly, yes, it's a refurbishment as opposed to a reclub.
Yes, refurbishment of what were, I'm guessing, probably originally local authority flats.
Yes, I would think so in that location.
Yeah. And are now probably in again a housing trust.
Yeah.
And again, probably.
It says City West, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably again publicly funded this, isn't it?
I don't know. I'm sure there is an element, possibly a substantial element of public funding.
And we can see that the permission was secured in January 2011, and indeed the refurbishment programme, we say, commenced in January 2011. So that is at about the time that this planning application was submitted.
Just afterwards.
Yeah. But of course, the truth of the matter is that those are existing flats. Something has to be done with them, really, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And indeed, it doesn't really, well, clearly looking at the timescale there, it would all have been planned before this application was submitted. And quite frankly, given their existing flats and something has to be done with them, and there's a substantial element of public funding, again, it doesn't really tell us anything about what's happening or the impact of this proposal, does it?
Yeah, without knowing all the details, all it tells us is that there is no indication that this proposal, or awareness of this proposal, certainly Salford would have been aware of it, in any way affected their decision to progress.
And then if we turn to the final one, which is Eccles New Road West, that is our local authority scheme,
yes,
isn't it? Publicly funded.
Yes.
And the first phase we can see was completed very shortly after the planning application made in this case.
Yes.
So again, clearly all committed long before.
Yes, I'm sure that is correct. That's me.
So again, it doesn't really demonstrate anything, does it?
Well, all it does is show that it has gone ahead within that time scale in council's knowledge of this proposal.
Well, I would suggest to you it must have stopped before the council had any knowledge of this proposal.
Sorry?
It must have been completed, first phase completed in February 2011. It must have started before the council had any knowledge of this proposal, because it couldn't have had knowledge of the proposal before the middle of 2010, could it?
Well, yes, because we went in first, going back to page 1 of Mr. Harrington's, it's got the dates usually set out.
Yeah.
We advertised public consultation in July 2010.
Yeah.
I can't tell you without checking when we first had contact with Salford Council at that point on the scheme.
Okay. Now, if we then turn back to Mr. Hetherington's report, we've got Eden Square there, phase 2.
What page are we on?
Sorry, this is the development of community projects and public funding.
Yeah.
We've got Eden Square there, phase 2, which we've discussed. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Barton Village, again, I think that is actually then the same development that we discussed just before with you, isn't it?
Yes.
And Eccles New Road West is again the same development that we just discussed. So what we're left with here now, I think, is the land between the Ship Canal and Liverpool Road Eccles, which is the Salford Reds Stadium and the land around it, I think.
Yes.
Okay. The relocation of the rugby club in Salford was a long-standing scheme, wasn't it?
long-standing aspiration of the council, yes.
Yeah, both of the council, I think, and the club.
And of the club, yes.
Yeah. And indeed, there was obvious concern that the club, with the name Salford, didn't lose its association with Salford, so it should be somewhere in Salford.
Yes.
There was also a real concern, wasn't there, that if the club didn't get new facilities, it would not be able to continue in the league. It was under threat from the league.
Yes, I think that's a factor, a key factor for the club's wish to relocate.
Yeah. The position is that the original, there was originally a different proposal for the stadium, which was going to be an iconic building, which was considered in a call and inquiry in 2006.
Yes.
And did receive consent,
yes.
but proved to be too ambitious, I think. And to be fair, your clients, I think,
yes,
to some extent, rode to the rescue.
Yes, and I think I made reference to the initial permission. It was a permission which was granted for the new stadium, together with a substantial floor space and retail warehousing, which was going to help.
As enabling development.
That's an enabling development basis, yes.
Yeah.
As you say, that wasn't achievable, proved not to be achievable, and the revised proposal is the one that's been implemented.
And indeed, as part of proving their case to the Secretary of State, Salford Reds Club demonstrated there wasn't anywhere else they could go to, didn't they?
Yes, I recall the details. I wasn't involved in that application, but I'm sure they did an assessment of alternative sites. Yes.
So there was a pressing need for the club to relocate, nowhere else for it to go to. It's hardly surprising that's where they've ended up.
Well, it's not surprising that that's where they've ended up, but it still demonstrates that scheme has progressed in this timescale. Yeah. And clearly, if the club had their own resources that they could rely upon to build it, they would have built it some years ago. But it is an investment by people in the location.
And then finally, we're left with the leisure centre, which again is another publicly funded scheme.
Yes.
I think, again, not within the area of concern raised by the local authority. I think, is this site 14? It is. It's site 14 on your plan.
It's in Earl, it's not that far from Calisac.
Yeah, well, again, the inspector can go a little better.
Further in towards the centre than towards the motorway.
Yeah. So publicly funded scheme in an area that's not an area raised in the reasons for refusal. It doesn't really tell us anything about the reasons for refusal.
Well, again, it tells us that investment has progressed in the timescale that we're looking at, and there's no indication that it's been affected at all by the proposals.
Oh, very good. Now, I think that's it. I don't think there's anything else of relevance in Mr. Hetherington's report that we should look at.
Those are the schemes that he has dealt with that inform his judgment.
Yeah, and I think I haven't read through his conclusions, but I don't think his conclusions then add anything to the details that we've seen there, do they? Unless there's something to say to me. Sure.
I can't say other than his conclusions are based on the schemes that he has reviewed.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Right, now you rely upon a number of decision letters to support your conclusion, I think, that there will be no harmful impact upon regeneration, don't you?
Yes.
And as we've already agreed, what is clear from those decision letters is that they do accept that this is a material consideration that needs to be addressed.
Yes.
But then they come to particular conclusions on the particular circumstances of the case and the evidence before them, don't they?
Well, yes, obviously they're all decisions based on the particular circumstances of the case in front of the inspector and Secretary of State.
Yeah. Indeed, if we look at the Battlefield Road decision, which I think is your Appendix 6, isn't it? So I think we have to turn to the other volume of appendices.
Yes.
If we look at page Appendix 6, page 28.
28.
Yeah.
Yes.
Page 28, paragraph 98, what the inspector says there is, I don't consider reference to the operation of other incinerators, such as those in Portsmouth and Eastcroft, adds much to the appellant's case. The appellant's, of course, were people promoting the proposal, weren't they, Mr. Singh?
That's what he says, yes, sir.
Much depends on the particular local circumstances and context in terms of relationship with neighbouring users, their particular effects on property prices and investment decisions. So many considerations might influence outcomes, and experience in those cases cannot reliably be used to inform a view about how the proposed EWF would be likely to be perceived, or if built would be likely to be received within its own local context. Do you agree with his general approaches about
Yeah, I know. Again, I haven't seen the evidence that was put in front of the inspector, but what I think he is saying there is that the evidence that was produced by the parties at the inquiry in respect of Portsmouth and Eastcroft, he did not think provided any precedent, if you like, for reaching his conclusion on this one. Quite rightly, he said you have to look at the circumstances. That's different, for example, to a report which looks at a range of different proposals.
Just a simple question then, Mr. Singh.
Yes.
Do you agree or disagree with his general approach there?
Well, his approach is right. As I say, I don't know the details of Portsmouth and Eastcroft, but his approach to consider the appeal in the context of the local circumstances on the site clearly is correct.
So we are in agreement that much will depend upon the local circumstances.
Yes.
And of course the evidence is before the inspector.
Indeed.
And indeed, I think that also, for example, is the sort of situation that we see in Cornwall, isn't it?
Well, I think Cornwall, the inspector did refer to the DTZ report.
I beg your pardon, sir?
I think the inspector referred to the DTZ report.
Yes, I think it is. Is Cornwall Appendix 5? I think it is. Yes, it is.
I
So
think it's in the volume.
have to put the other one back. Yeah, sorry.
It's a very long report.
It is indeed. It's I think probably one to be reused rather than recycled to be sustainable given the length of it.
Survived the court of appeal. And a very careful examination
Yes, I'm sure
its content.
I'm sure it did.
It could be reused to kill insects crawling across the floor. Not sure what else. Where are we going?
No, well, what the position I'm putting to you is that, again, the inspector in Cornwall clearly founded his decision on the local circumstances and the evidence before him, didn't he? And followed the same approach as in the Battlefield's approach, didn't he?
Yes, he looked at the evidence. I mean, the particular issue there was the potential effect on the China clay community, which was a community, I think, which was found to be fragile.
Yeah.
The whole industry found to be fragile for reasons that we don't need to go into. And more importantly, because that had been such a significant employer in Cornwall, clearly that was an issue of critical importance to the inquiry. But he does, I think, then take himself to address where there is evidence elsewhere.
And if,
with regard to other studies in regions.
yeah, no, I'm not suggesting otherwise. If we turn to page 351, I think that's where he starts. 351.
Yep.
That's
Yes,
where he
that's
starts the
the
section on the
China
impact
clay
upon
part.
regeneration of China clay communities,
Yep.
isn't it? And we can see he goes through it, and I think we have been through it, or parts of it already.
Right.
We can look at any bit you want us to look at, Mr. Singleton, but can I just have a look at paragraph 2075, which is page 353.
Yes.
And we can see that concerns being expressed here is the council suggested that more image and environmentally conscious firms would be deterred from moving to the business park, such as food processing companies. The claim was made that those on the business park would be able to see the top of the stack of the circ facility. After looking in the direction of the circ site from the vicinity of the proposed business park, park during a programme of site visits, I am dubious whether the stack would be visible, although I accept on occasion the plume arising from the stack may be seen. Even if the top of the stack could be seen, it would be viewed across an intervening scene comprising tips and clay workings. The nature of the intervening landscape is such that the stack would not be seen as obtrusive or unduly conspicuous. As for the plume, the area around the cirque facility contains a number of stacks which give rise to plumes. Within this context, the plume would not be unusual or out of place and would in any case be seen from some distance. So, I mean, he clearly looks at the point that's being made about impact upon what we're told, more image and environmentally conscious firms. And he relates it to the particular circumstances of the case, doesn't he?
Yes.
Where in actual fact, what he's telling us, politely, is that the view you'd have towards the site isn't great in the first place. Isn't great in the first place.
Well, I'm not sure he is saying that. He's saying that the stack won't be visible for the reason of the context of the site. I think he's saying that he doesn't think that the stack will be particularly visible.
Yes, oh yes, no, that's the first point he makes. Yeah. You're quite right. He says, I'm not even convinced you're going to see the stack. But then he goes on to say, doesn't he, that even if you did, what's the problem? Because look what else you're seeing anyway.
Yeah, but I think that's part of the visual context. It's not part of whether or not the area is one which people would want to invest in. I make that distinction.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, it's done, isn't it, in on the same page as he goes on to consider evidence from other parts of the country, which you drew our attention to, paragraph 2078.
Yes, and there seems to be a response to an argument which has been advanced by the council that he should have regard to other locations, and he's, I think, reviewed the decision in Edmonton and said there was no information to suggest that impact had been experienced.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say at 279, the council's objection in this respect is based on perception. Perception may constitute material planning consideration, but to be given weight, the perception must be supported by evidence. No evidence in this case, while the evidence from elsewhere in the country is the presence of an EFW doesn't discourage or deter economic activity. The council's stance fails to have regard to the benefits that the cirque plan is likely to bring to the economy, and then he sets out what those are in the next paragraph. And then he tells us in 2081, the council and others suggested that the presence of the cirque facility would have a negative impact upon Cornwall as a tourist destination. Although the cirque plant would be visible from the A30, the main route into western part of the county, probably should be the main route into the western part of the county for tourists, the cirque plant would be seen at some distance and would be viewed against a backdrop of mineral workings, tips and associated large-scale buildings associated with the China clay industry. In these circumstances, I do not consider that the cirque development is likely to deter visitors to Cornwall. So we see he's back again to the point, isn't he, of location, location, location. Well, this is an area that's already very affected by this type of development, he's saying, isn't he?
That is true in respect to whether or not the stack in this case would be out of character, out of place, and therefore highly visible both to residents, to residents, to tourists, and those who might want to invest in the area. And he concludes that it is not. But in reaching his conclusion about the likely economic impact of the proposal in this case on the China clay industry, and indeed on other aspects of the investment in terms of the food processing he mentioned, for example, he reaches those conclusions about the likely impact, both on the evidence that was in front of him about this particular proposal, but also with reference to reports from elsewhere, including the DTZ study, which is mentioned at 2078. So he does feature that in his consideration and in informing his conclusion. And what he's saying is, I can't see there's any particular issue here, and the evidence from elsewhere does not demonstrate that there is a likelihood of such a proposal having an adverse impact on investment. And I would just add that this is in very different circumstances to the situation that we have in front of us, where we had in Cornwall an economic dependence in the past on the China clay industry, which had been very significantly degraded over a number of years, and therefore significant problems of new employment opportunities for its population. In a location which, because of its geography and its accessibility one which is very, very difficult to attract new investment. So the circumstances are quite different. We don't have that situation here, and we've seen from Mrs. Harding's figures, this is a population which enjoys very good accessibility to economic investment. So the conditions are really quite different.
Well, the position is this, isn't it, Mr. Singleton? That in none of the appeal decisions which you have cited have the Inspector or the Secretary of State expressed the view or concluded that this form of development cannot, as a matter of principle, have an impact upon regeneration. They have looked at and addressed the circumstances of the case in front of them, haven't they?
With previous material.
Thank you. And indeed, whether or not it will have an impact upon regeneration, and if so, the extent of any such impact, will depend upon the circumstances of the case and the evidence. And that, again, that's a view, I think, isn't it, that we see expressed by the local planning sector in East Sussex.
Well, yes, I mean, the reason for making the reference to the West Sussex is to make the distinction between the New Haven report and the DTZ report that we've already talked about.
Well, I think I understand that. Yeah. But if we just take out his extract bit. The left, Mr. Singleton, what's the rebuttal appendices? I was very upset. The rebuttal appendices, it's appendix A, isn't it?
We've been through so many appendices, I've totally forgotten where that one is.
Oh, sorry, no, it's appendix A. I knew it was in your rebuttal appendices, but what I couldn't do was find them. And I think, oh, excuse me, I think it's at page 121
yes,
of his report. He addresses the social and economic aspects.
Yes, there's a fairly full summary of the report, so we weren't leaving out any.
No,
I think this is the relevant part.
I must confess, Mr. Singleton, I have trusted you. I haven't gone away and checked the report myself, but you clearly have produced other parts, which is very fair. But I think the sort of key bit that you're drawing our attention to on this topic is there.
2.30
yeah.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. And if we go to the very end of the section of paragraph 2237, we can see that having viewed all of the evidence, or summarised the evidence in front of him, given his view on it, he tells us, I conclude that this proposal, as recommended to be modified, would not have an adverse effect on either social deprivation or regeneration prospects of the town.
That's correct.
And we've got to bear in mind that he's telling us it's as recommended to be modified.
Yes.
And we get a bit of an explanation as to what he's got in mind there, don't we? If we go on just to paragraph 2240 at the bottom of the page. And we see what he says is, by far the biggest concern raised by local people is over the risk of harmful emissions if an incinerator were built. I refer to the detailed analysis of this issue in part 36 for the reasons set out there. I conclude that whether an incinerator was acceptable or not would depend on a detailed study of an actual proposal in the light of the standards and controls applying at the time. I do not consider that the option should be ruled out as a matter of principle at this stage. However, because of this uncertainty, I would also conclude that sites shouldn't be allocated in the plan specifically for incinerators. And that's effectively the modification that he makes, actually, that he widens what the site can be used for, doesn't he?
Yes, I think what he's saying, if I understand it correctly, is that whilst he is supporting the allocation should not expressly be for an incinerator.
Yeah, he widens the potential.
He wants it
he widens it, yeah.
So that the detailed effects can be looked at
at
an application stage. I think that's the.
Yeah. So when we look at his conclusion that it wouldn't have an adverse effect on social deprivation or regeneration prospects, we have to bear in mind that that's a conclusion that's informed by his recommendation that the proposal should be modified.
Yes.
And his recommendation that it should be modified is because in actual fact he's saying at the end of the day whether there's an issue or not will depend upon the precise details of the actual proposal that is then advanced.
Yes, I think that's correct.
Yeah. So again, he's not actually forming a final view on this at all, is he?
No, he's certainly accepting that it is a consideration, but he has had put to him that as a matter of principle, a development at that time would have an adverse effect, and he has quite squarely rejected that as a matter of fact.
Yeah, well, because you're saying you need to see what's actually you get at the end of the day, don't you?
Yes, but as I say, the purpose of including this was to deal with the New Haven study upon which Mrs. Harding places great reliance, and to demonstrate that that has been very squarely rejected as an indication of what the likely impact would be, not just by this inspector, but by other inspectors as well.
Yeah. Well, his comment on that, I think, is in 2235, then, isn't it? Which is
yes.
the bit you're really drawing our attention to. He starts, first of all, by saying in the first part of the paragraph that a lot of the complaints are based on a misconception as to what's really being proposed.
Yes.
And then he goes in the middle of the paragraph, he says, turning to the studies referred to, the incinerator at North Andover is an incinerator where there were problems, and he believes such an incinerator wouldn't get planning permission or an IPPC consent.
Yes.
Permit, at New Haven.
Yep.
And then he says, as to the UK studies, what they show is that incinerators tend to be located in industrial areas where the prices of any houses are relatively low. I don't find it demonstrated by this research that the incinerators cause the industry to be there or the house prices to be lower. I mean, all he's really saying, and I think that is to be fair, sorry, just before I ask you the question, I think that's all that we do get in regard to his conclusions on those studies.
Yeah, he's basically saying, as I understand it, that he has looked at the New Haven study, which relies to a large extent upon what has happened in North Andover, which of course is in a different place, subject to an entirely different regulatory regime.
Yeah.
And is what we might refer to as an old type of incinerator. So it doesn't help.
Yeah.
But
just to do my
yeah.
point first, I think that is all. I don't think there's anywhere else we should go to, is there? So we can just deal with that. I mean, when we look at, and ultimately, obviously, the inspector will form his own view, but when we look at what he says there, all he's really saying is that he wasn't satisfied that those studies alone demonstrated to him that the proposal would have an effect such as not to be appropriate to make the allocation that we have in the plan.
Well, he's rejected, I think, the proposal that was being put to him by objectors as a matter of principle. I can use that term. The inspector will understand what I mean. That it would be inappropriate to allocate a site where there is a possibility of an incinerator being developed because it is a waste allocation. To reject that on principle because it is likely or probable that it will have an adverse effect. I think that's what the inspector's rejected. He has then, quite rightly, as you say, he said, well, I reject that as a matter of principle, but I recognise that there are detailed considerations, and the best way to deal with this is to allocate the site but not specify its use for an incinerator.
I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that people demand higher standards now with respect to this sort of plant than was demanded in the 1980s or even the 1990s.
Yeah. Absolutely true.
So, I mean, it's interesting though, then, isn't it, that when we turn to what the inspector says about the North Andover study, he's saying, well, this was a 1980s development, and the report's early 1990s. It's an incinerator that we just wouldn't allow nowadays, is what he's saying, really. But that doesn't really address the point, does it, that in actual fact, what we require nowadays is even better, and people demand better, than was the position in the past.
But that is why the standards are different and the emission targets are different. And that is why you have the advice from all the experts that modern plants, which are well managed, are unlikely to cause these sort of problems.
Yeah, but it doesn't really address the point, does it? Because we're talking here about perception and the impact that may have on confidence and or on the market. And if in actual fact people are demanding even higher standards now, that filters into and drives their perception, doesn't it?
Well, I accept that as an argument, but we come back to the main point of the discussion that perception, yes, it is material, but the way that the Inspector and Secretary of State decide to give it must be informed by the question of whether there is any evidence in order to substantiate those perceptions. Yeah. And I think this is what the Inspector is doing.
But given that perception filters into those factors, the higher demands filter into those factors, they will also have an impact, won't they, upon market confidence and market prices and regeneration.
Well, if we're talking about public perception, or we're talking about perception of investors?
Well, both really, aren't we? Because in actual fact, investors can only invest if they hope to get a return, can't they?
Yes.
They're sensible.
Yes.
And they're only going to get a return, ultimately, if the public buy their product, aren't they?
In whatever way that public purchase happens, yes.
Yeah, I mean, to put the old sort of estate agents thing, your house is only worth what somebody's prepared to pay for it. Yeah. And so, if in actual fact, people, the public, have these concerns, and assuming they do have a choice in these matters, that will affect their choice and also affect what they're prepared to pay for the product.
Well, yes, I accept the theory of that, but the reports that we have looked at clearly demonstrate that as a matter of principle that is not the case, and the experience of where incinerators are being developed demonstrate that those effects have not happened. So that's the context in which we have to consider those perceptions. Now, to extend the argument that you're putting to me, if the perceptions over the last 25 years or more have led to the European directive and all the agencies involved to increase the requirements and the environmental standards against which this this proposed land and others must perform, then actually you would expect the perceptions to be reduced over time. And I think that's what's happened in relation to, for example, the wastewater treatment site, which we have been told clearly was a problem in the past, particularly in terms of problems of odour. Mrs. Harding has told us that there's been a lot of investment made in that site to remove, and she said in one place those problems have now almost been removed or worse to that effect. And it's clear that those improvements and the increase of the environmental standard to which that plant has operated clearly has had a positive impact in how the community have viewed the facility. And that seems to me to be an example of how perception can be affected in a positive way by increasing standards.
Mr. Singleton, I know that you think the public are mistaken in their views, but I think you would accept that it is clear from just attending this inquiry that there is public concern and the public perception of this proposal is not positive, is it?
No, it's not. I accept that.
Now, I know you say for all sorts of reasons they're mistaken about that, Mr. Singleton, but the fact of the matter remains that whether they're mistaken or not, what ultimately drives the market in these matters is what the people believe, isn't it?
Well, that's what drives the perceptions, but what the inspector has to address himself to is what weight should he give to those perceptions. And I say that has to be made on the basis of what evidence there is.
And if we just go back, which is where I started this, and I'd just like to try to take it back to where I started the question. If in actual fact the public are demanding higher standards now than they were 20 years ago, it is no answer to the North Andover study, as is suggested by this inspector, that the standards themselves are now higher. The problem is that the public demand more, don't they?
Well, they do, but that's a problem for the government, not for me, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's also quite plain, and indeed we've got some evidence of it, I think, from just the way the public have reacted here, this inquiry, that the increase in standards has not assuaged public concern.
Well, I think that might be true in terms of perceptions. I don't think that's true in terms of people's actual experience of plants once they are up and running. And I could, for example, refer to there is only one energy from waste plant in Greater Manchester, which is in Bolton. I dealt with a planning application for that quite a few years ago now to convert that from an old-style municipal waste incinerator to an EFW plant, which was being done for very good reason, because the plant at that time was in breach of the then directive and was going back one or two directives. And that was an extremely controversial proposal. I stood in Bolton Town Hall with about 250 people shouting me down saying this is terrible. but I think if you went and asked people involved in that whether that actually has had any adverse impact on their well-being or their confidence or anything else, I think the conclusion would probably be, well, no, it's actually all right.
Yeah, but I mean, if we just try to conclude this particular section, Mr. Singleton, the fact that we're operating to higher standards now does not actually mean that public concern or perception is any the less than it was, does it?
Well, it isn't. It hasn't reduced the discussion here. What I'm saying is, I think if you would propose, not that you would necessarily do it for all sorts of other reasons, but if you were to propose a facility in a location where the public has a great deal of knowledge about the actual impacts of a similar proposal, then their reaction would be very different. And again, without taking the inspector's time, I could give examples of where that has happened on what would be regarded on the face of it as controversial projects, whether it's with deposits of low-level nuclear waste, whether it's with other minerals projects, where there is a familiarity and understanding of the actual impact, people do actually perceive the proposal in a different way and a more positive way. That is my experience.
Now, Mr. Singleton, you acknowledge, I think, that house prices may be a signal of the relative health of an area.
They're one indication.
Yeah. Well, and clearly they are an indication of how attractive people find an area to live, aren't they? Assuming that there's a function,
they're a reflection of how attractive.
Assuming there's a functioning market and there's a choice, they are.
If there is, yes.
And there's no reason, I think, to suggest that there's anything other than a functioning market and choice in Greater Manchester as a whole, or even in Trafford.
Well, there's a functioning market in the context of the overall housing market, yes.
And that, again, is clearly, as we think agreed, affected, amongst other things, by people's perception of how attractive the area is to live.
Indeed.
And so, house prices, whilst house prices are not of themselves a material consideration, obviously we're not here simply to protect house prices, they are an indicator, I think, aren't they, as to whether there's issues of concern flagged up.
They are.
Sure.
They could be.
And they are also quite a significant indicator as to how attractive an area may be thought to be to invest in, both in houses and in other development.
Well, again, I don't say they're an indication.
Indeed, it's really something that is clearly monitored by businesses when they're looking at where to make their investments and how healthy areas are listed.
Monitored by investors?
Businesses
Well,
make
yes,
decisions.
yes, and if a business, for example, was choosing where to relocate and set up a new production facility or whatever else it might be, that is one of the factors that they will take into account. I'm sure they would research that as they would things like schools, for example, leisure facilities for the people that they need to bring in order to set up that new facility.
And there is clearly evidence before this inquiry from the local community that this proposal will affect their own investment decisions in the area, isn't there?
Well, there is evidence that they are concerned about that, and they've indicated, some people have indicated that if this goes ahead, they are likely to sell their property and relocate.
Yeah. Talking about the willingness to stay and, of course, consequently to invest in the area, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, I know you don't agree that that's what the outcome will be, but that's the evidence we have.
I think it's unlikely, based on my experience of other projects.
Now, if we turn to your proof, please, Mr.
It's about, it's about one.
Yes.
So I would like to break soon. Would you like to be much longer?
I would hope I'm not going to be more than another half an hour, so.
Okay, well I think we will take a break if it's going to be that long. And we'll break it to 2 o'clock, please. We're going to hear afterwards Mr. Cunnington will have some questions, and then a re-examination from Mr. Kingston. I think we do need to think about, I think it's probably unlikely we'll finish this afternoon, even if we sit till 5 o'clock. It would be my estimate at the moment. So the options would be to go either to tomorrow after we've heard. We've got about 15 to 20 people to speak at 9:30. So we could continue after that. And it's hard to estimate how long that will take, but I guess it might take some 2 hours. Otherwise, we'll have to think about going to Tuesday. But perhaps you can have a think about that.